Good evening from our studio here in Kiev. This is the Sunday Show on Hromadske International, the only primetime English language television program covering the Eastern European geopolitical storm. I'm Ian Bateson.
Good evening, my name is Angelina Karyakina. As always, we're bringing a vivid analytical picture of the week, not only here in Ukraine, but also in other countries of Europe and the world. We will talk tonight about a year, an anniversary since Russia annexed Crimea. We will have a very interesting guest talking on that. We will talk about Russian opposition in London, and we will also talk about the current situation in the East, basically about the recent updates on the ceasefire, on the situation on the ground. In fact, we have our correspondent, Natalia Gumenyuk, who is right there in the east. She decided to travel closely to the area which was cut off as recent as February, just to see how life has changed there for the ordinary people. How do they live? How do they manage their lives in this area? Natalia is traveling to Artemivsk. It's one of the biggest cities which is close to this area. Many people come to this city to get their pensions, to get their social payments, and also to get passes which will help them cross the neutral territory from the government control area to the militant control area, back and forth. So we will try to get in touch with Natalia right now, and she will tell us more about the situation on the ground. Natalia, do you hear us? Good evening.
Yeah, sure, I can hear.
So what's the situation on the ground, Natalia?
Be ready to share what we have learned. So I would explain that we traveled a lot on the really close to the front line, to the connection line near Debaltsevo, the city which was the place of the major and the last assault, so some kilometers away from the separatist controlled area. And what we should at least mean at this area, it's 100 kilometers area, so there is no shelling any longer. Maybe some random attack, but rather it's rather calm. It doesn't mean that the whole Ukrainian front line is like that, but at least this 100-kilometer part of land near Debaltsevo is pretty calm. Though there is a lot of invisible, legacy of this recent fight, both for the military, to the local population, and it's feel that, for instance, that people are pretty exhausted. So we went also to the city of Svetlodarsk. It's really just 15-20 kilometers from Debaltsevo, the closest small town nearby. So when you talk to the people, they're really a bit confused already that, they can't even understand who has started, why it all started, and what's really happening. But because of it's spring, because there is no any more snow, there is a good weather, it's kind of feeling of some hope that people are hoping that it will remain calm. But in general, I think the most important to understand the situation is still very complex. It's not just complicated, but complex. It very much depends on whom you talk, what about you talk. So for instance, a village will look very much abandoned or someplace, and later, after some time, you understand it's heavily fortified. So it's very dubious. You can talk to military. Some of them would be really complaining about the lack of ammunition, or for instance, that they are too long on the front line, or there are too many losses. But later you go to the doctors, you go to the medics, or somebody else from the same battalion, and the people would say totally different thing, that more or less the situation is calm, there is no such a problem with ammunition or anything else, that there are not that many wounded. So for instance, there are rumors still now that there are so many dead since, for instance, since the Debaltsevo. But when you talk to the doctors in the hospital, which were the first point for all the people who were dead, killed and wounded from this major assault, they would say that there is 120 soldiers who had died while there, for instance, 50 of them during the fight, and all of them were just, the people who died during this area. So
Natalia, sorry to interrupt you. Natalia, just sorry to interrupt you. We know that there's a regime of ceasefire. What is the biggest challenge for those people that are now living in this area? We know that there is a constant risk of fire, but for them, what is the most challenge and the most, let's say, thing that they're thinking all of the time? What is the most complicated thing for them?
It's all very traumatic experience for everybody, both for the military to the civilians, just not understanding what will happen next. Because people try to pretend that everything is absolutely fine, even if there is, that everything would be fine. So nobody is kind of mentally still not prepared to be ready, to abandon their place. So even if you stay in the village, which is 15 kilometers from the front line, at the moment when there is no shelling, you kind of try to believe that it's all over, and you cannot plan your life. The other problem, huge problem, is the lack of jobs. So we talked to many IDPs. The problem for them is not just the food or something, because the volunteers are bringing, there is really supply for the food and clothes. And yes, there is a problem to find the place to stay, because for many people who left for a couple of weeks, they understand that maybe they have left for good, they have left for a year or more. That's also mentally already very challenging. We should understand that events have started here almost a year or like 11 months ago, but you can't really find jobs in the region. So after you, for half a year, don't have a job, it's making your life very complicated.
Absolutely. And just to ask a question off of that, Natalia, I mean, you're talking about how the war has affected these areas, and in particular the area you've been, parts of it have changed hands, was held by separatists, now controlled by Ukrainian forces again. But we have a question from one of our viewers, a tweet from MPAS, asking you, shouldn't Ukraine's politicians travel more to that region so that people could talk to them directly? I mean, do you think it would really help politicians to see this directly and to talk to people and see what the reality there on the front lines is?
I definitely would confirm this idea, because it's really, you feel kind of void of, just simple answers for the simple questions about a daily life. So that would be really, really helpful. And that's what exactly, by the way, the military say, because you really feel that some soldiers would feel the grief, how it affected the whole region was for years, that it's really deprived area. So it's definitely necessary also for the journalists, for the people from the other area, just to understand what is alive here, which is not that visible. That when it's shooting, it's visible that the problems are there. When it's not, you kind of don't understand what is the heart.
Well, it remains more abstract when people's attention isn't on it because there is an active fighting. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Natalia, for that update.
Okay, thank you. All the best.
Now, of course, here at Hromadske, we're very fortunate in that we have many correspondents who work near the front lines. Natalia is one of them, but we also have our own Angelina, who's here in the studio today, who came back from Luhansk region.
Yes, right.
Could you describe your trip a little bit and what you saw there?
Actually, we've got a video which we'll show just right in several minutes. I will just introduce this little video we have for you. It's a little teaser or trailer of the film we made from Luhansk. We actually witnessed an operation by the volunteers, both Ukrainian and Russian, trying to help people from Luhansk and Luhansk region, not only city of Luhansk, to, let's say, leave this militant control area for different reasons. And this operation really something went wrong during this operation. One of the initiators, one of the volunteers, a Russian photographer, volunteer.
We had on our program
Yeah,
last
we actually
week,
had her last week on our program, Victoria Ivleva. She was held hostage for almost 4 hours, and a bus full of women, children, and elderly was turned back to Luhansk, and people stayed there for the reasons we don't know. But let's just watch the small video, and then we'll
Take
get
a
back
look
to
at that now.
Придется мне вывозить сегодня старика. Слышишь? Лен, у него силикоз. И, видимо, идет приступ. Ну, наверное, типа чего-то такого. Потому что он даже не встает. Я вот думаю, чего взять? С собой купить? Еще раз повтори. Угу. Может, подушку кислородную купить? Это кто у меня приехал? Это кто приехал?
Вам должны были передать какие-то вещи и документы. Там они... Давайте.
Так, а вы кто? Я Даша. Ага, Даша. А ты кто?
Да я Рома.
Ты Рома. А вы... Вы едете в Яготин к бабушке?
Да.
Все, понятно. Ну, пойдем, Буся.
Проходите.
С мамой пойдем.
Скажи спасибо. Скажи
Смотри, вон
большое.
какая там другая машинка большая.
Он всегда тебя фотографирует.
Пойдем посмотрим. Пойдем, я тебе покажу. Пойдем. Вот смотри, на какой ты машинке.
Смотри, сынуль.
Это Лешина машина.
Так,
Давайте.
вы с ребеночком, наверное, вот сюда вот.
Как узнали, что можно вот таким путем выехать?
Через тетю. Познакомила меня тетя родная. Сказала, можно вывезти отсюда ребеночка.
А вы дальше куда планируете, как?
Я Гатин до бабушки. У меня там бабушка.
Надолго, как думаете?
Думаю, наверное, всегда отсюда.
А почему решили уезжать?
Из-за войны.
Надоело всем уже эта война.
Тетя маленькая
Она
боится.
по вот так стоит уже. Она никому не нужна. Ни старикам, ни детям.
All right, and just to remind you, as always, the full versions of these videos, which are much longer with a lot more detail, are available on our website. For English language Hromadske, that's en.hromadske.tv. So please check that out, because we invest a lot of time and energy in all these, and we do want to share them. But coming back to our own correspondent, who's there,
Right.
Angelina, what's the mood? Because, you know, there is a ceasefire right now, certainly imperfect, but maybe a situation less dire than before. Was there a lot of movement going on, and did people feel under pressure?
Actually, there's a huge problem with people, with those people who want to, for different reasons. Again, I'm not talking about any political reasons here to leave Luhansk. We should keep in mind that even if we have this so-called ceasefire regime, people are in constant fear of shelling, and they do want to leave this area, especially mothers with kids, elderly people who can't get proper medical help in there, and there is practically no other way for them. Because those ways are really complicated, and we could see in this video that a woman with a small child explains that she wanted to leave, but it was very complicated for her to get this pass, for example, an official way.
Well, and this is what's been introduced and is more recent, where previously
Right.
people were able to move across, you know, from Ukrainian-controlled territory to separatists who receive support from Russia to
Right.
their territory. Now there's a pass system which complicates
Now they need a
that.
pass, which is a really complicated system, because in fact, in reality, it looks like this. A person should arrive to the checkpoint, give a pack of documents, not a pack, okay, several papers, which the person should need to be copied and prepared. And then on the checkpoint, you have only soldiers. Sometimes, very often, they don't know what to do with these documents, and they tell those people, okay, just arrive, let's say, come back in 3 weeks and we'll see, because sometimes they don't know what to do. And to get to this checkpoint, there is no transport, obviously. People need to pay taxi drivers, and it's sometimes several hundred hryvnias, which those people don't
Well,
have.
when they're not able to take it out from bank machines and when it's very hard to get access
Sure. This
to
is
cash.
why they are asking volunteers to help with that. And in this particular operation, let's call it like that, an unknown problem occurred, and when Victoria, the Russian photographer and volunteer who did it many times, went to the militant control area, went to this checkpoint to meet the bus with the people, she was stopped, she was interrogated, and she stayed there for almost 4 hours without any explanation. And the bus was turned away.
And I mean, this is the daily risk that people face. I mean, on the one hand, it seems from what you've told me and what your film shows, it's really volunteers and volunteer organizations that facilitate a lot of the moving of people, whether it's to Russia or whether it's to Ukraine. So these people who do this, they live with a lot of uncertainty every day and face different
Yes,
challenges.
the next day after this operation, let's say failed operation to some extent, the bridge which people had to cross was destroyed, was literally destroyed on the next day. So we have a ceasefire regime, but how could that happen?
So there's still the danger of that. I mean, does Luhansk region and what they face there, does that differ from Donetsk? Is there more? What are the differences?
Many people, of course, I haven't crossed this military border, let's say, there, but from what I could hear from the people, that the situation in so-called LNR is much more complicated than in DNR. We have different groups controlling different areas, like so-called Cossacks, and different.
Well, and that's what we hear a lot, that I think in the coverage, no one would refer to separatist-controlled Donetsk as being, particularly well organized, but certainly more centralized than Luhansk.
Exactly.
And that creates this interesting situation that if you're trying to move people out, it increases the number of people who could say no, or could stop you, or could interrogate you, and things like that.
So it's different. It's different with Luhansk. It's really different with Luhansk. But still, some people are traveling back and forth, and they, knowing all the risks, they go back and forth, because many people have splitted families. For example, we had a young girl who had no other choice but to visit her two grandmothers in Luhansk, but she's studying in Kharkiv, and she's traveling back and forth just to check on them. She cannot evacuate them. She needs to travel all the time.
Well, and I mean, from the people that you spoke to, did they give a reason why they waited so long to leave? I mean, there have been different waves of people who've been evacuating. Did anyone say, what the reason was for them now to try and go?
Oh, they did. They actually, some of them, they were, let's say, trying to get to know what's the official way to leave. And in fact, there are almost no official way to leave, right? So they were asking their relatives, their friends, they were looking for neighbors who left this territory and who could share the information, how you can do that. Some of them were trying to do it through this pass control system, but they couldn't find money, or they waited too long for the pass, and they had some really important reasons to leave this territory as soon as possible. For example, they had some family issues, or they had exams in the university, or they needed their pensions, their social payments, or they needed an operation in the hospital.
And this is what I find so interesting about what you've spoken about and other people have mentioned. It's not as if daily life stops. I mean, people still have those kind of normal things, getting paid, operations, waiting for things, and it seems very hard to break that rhythm, to get up and move and leave everything.
Right. Actually, we will show the story maybe in several days. We had a very interesting. We met a very interesting family of two. They live. Say just right on the checkpoint, on the front line, on the fire line, and they have no place to live. They have chickens, they have dogs, they have a huge house. Well, not a huge. They have a house, they have a garden, and they grow vegetables. Let's say this is the place where they live, and they cannot leave, and they live with their ordinary lives. Understanding that anytime a bomb may come over their head, because they live right on the fire line, and they still, they still do some ordinary things.
Their life continues.
Yeah, they go to the shop, they go to the to the drugstore. This is how it's life, and it never stops, even when war comes.
And as I mentioned before, the whole film is up on our website, so we'd encourage you all to take a look. But now we'll be moving into a slightly different direction.
Yeah, we will be moving forward to London. Actually, we have a very interesting guest on Skype. Ben Judah is a journalist and writer and author of a well-known, renowned book called Fragile Empire about Russia. Ben has traveled throughout Russia. He has interviewed many people, including Vladimir Putin himself, and we have lots of questions to discuss with Ben right now.
Ben, can you hear us, first and most importantly? How are we doing? Do we have contact? Oh, we're so close.
Probably Ben is.
Hopefully we'll get him back. I mean, one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to him today is he had a new article come out in Newsweek that was talking in particular about London. When it comes to Russia, London plays a very special role in general. First of all, that's where people who have money, many of them keep it there. But increasingly, for the opposition or for people getting into trouble, that tends to be go. And that makes it very relevant. I mean, it's interesting, too, to have Russian be a common language heard on the streets of London.
Yeah, so we would like not only to talk about this particular article, which is really interesting, talking about some changes in the life that the Russian opposition lives right now. We have some dramatic changes in the Russian political life after Boris Nemtsov was killed, and Ben probably will have something to say more about this, but we will also like to talk about Ben, about his book and about the personality of Vladimir Putin.
Well, it looks
right?
like we may have him again, so we'll give it, we'll try 2 times, maybe 3rd time's the charm. Ben, can you hear us? How are things in London?
Yeah, I can hear. I don't know what happened with the connection there. Where shall we begin talking about Russians in London and Putin in Moscow?
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask, because you made a point in your recent article that I thought was very interesting and very strong, talking about how the Kremlin has thrown out their own rule book when it comes to opposition politicians. And I was just curious what that meant.
Well, from around 2004 to 2011, there were a very clear set of rules that the Kremlin had towards the opposition, which was you could mount street protests, you could set up small parties, you could try and run for small office, and you would just be blocked or frustrated by a system that was designed to never let you really get in. And people were confident that that was one side of it, but the other side of it was that they were never going to really throw you in prison or shoot you, or there were never going to be any mass arrests if you were just a citizen activist or a sort of small opposition politician. And they only reserved that for the highest level, people like Khodorkovsky, who actually controlled chunks of the Russian economy. And even then, they never shot him or went after his family or sort of murdered his associates in some cold blood. And
that's what you were talking about, right? It was not going after people's families, and it was not being outright killed, which is what seems to be the case with Nemtsov. So there seems to be a new set of rules in play, right?
So people like Navalny and his associates, they felt confident that when they were starting in 2010, 2011, 2012, that they weren't going to be thrown into prison because they weren't oligarchs, and that they were probably not going to be harmed, and it seemed quite far-fetched and sort of pornographic for them to think about being shot or killed. And those rules have been torn up, and I find it very interesting to think about what happened in Crimea, more of a sort of internal coup in Russia. So Stalin mounted several coups against his own regime, rebooted his regime many times, and the Crimean gambit has permitted Putin to do that. And you've got a big change in how the economy works, a big change in the budget. It's now reaching 40% given to the military and security services. And one of these big changes is to do with the opposition. There's this new rule book of what they can and can't do.
But what's making that, this week, we were looking at the anniversary of Russian annexation of Crimea. And of course, after Russia annexed Crimea, one of the things we saw was that, Putin's approval ratings went, I think, 85% or higher. So is it just the approval ratings of Putin?
Let's talk about approval ratings. Really, really stupid. Like, opinion polls are developed for democracies, like Great Britain or the United States, where you can phone people up and they're going to talk honestly about what their political views are, and they know what their options are. Like here in Britain, you can phone people up and go, will you vote in the forthcoming election for Labour or Conservative? And they know what the Labour Party is and what the Labour Party's policies are, and the Labour Party's debating freely and canvassing freely. If in Britain the Labour Party leader was in prison and banned from all TV appearances, and the leader of the Liberal Democrats had been shot on Parliament Square, it's absolutely laughable to think you can phone people up and go, do you approve of the Prime Minister? Of course they're going to go, yes. Is you phone people, you can't do polling in a semi-dictatorial atmosphere. And it's one of the biggest Russian propaganda coups of the last decade that they have people talking about this mysterious 85% approval rating. Like, how is that conducted? That's conducted
Ben, sorry to interrupt. What do you think has changed? We have this situation with the Russian opposition leaders, or a leader in this particular case in London. What has changed? Why this is happening? Why do they feel at risk in London right now?
Well, running up to 2011 and 2012, the old Putin model was integrating. Support was going down, the system was becoming more unpopular, there was rising protest, a rise in internal dissent, and Putin felt that either he had to lead the disintegration of his own regime, or he had to lead the coup d'etat against his own regime and impose another one. He chose to lead a coup d'etat against his own regime and move towards a nationalist, dictatorial model that broke with a lot of the old established rules. And one of those now is that they need to really destroy the opposition as any organised political force because of the disintegration that's going on inside the Russian economy as a price for this new regime and this new foreign policy in Ukraine. One of the techniques they've developed is gaming Interpol. And they're starting to recommend their enemies to Interpol, which is the global policing cooperation organisation, and
See, and that I found very interesting because you've written about that, how they'll get the red notice for Russian opposition politicians and others. And I find that interesting because Ukraine has really struggled to use Interpol itself, to get similar warrants issued, or, I mean, it's a more complicated system than that, but to get similar things put out about Yanukovych and his colleagues. So it really, the Russians are much more slick when it comes to using Interpol and other international bodies.
Well, the fear is that the Russians would be capable of convincing smaller European countries to arrest opposition activists as they were travelling through them. And there's not, or a fear that they could push it through with their own allies or their own corrupt tentacles within the organisation or within British policing or German policing. And the Russian opposition are frightened about this because they just don't really know what's going to happen. These are people who never heard of it until it was started. Russia announced it was going to issue it for them. And what a red notice does is even if Britain is frankly unlikely to extradite people who are applying political asylum here, it means that you can be arrested at any national border. So it sort of forces these people to stay in Britain. It means they'd be very unlikely to travel to Eastern Europe or Central Europe or to Ukraine, for example. So it's just another way of harassing them.
And restricting their movements, yeah.
Restricting their movement, it's about just, the goal of, there are two kinds of goals of persecution. One is to actually destroy people, and the other is just to frighten them. And you use all kinds of techniques when you're persecuting people, just with the result of stressing them, frightening them. And if you can make Russian opposition activists believe that even if they flee the country, they're going to be hunted down by Interpol, and that your mysterious, corrupt networks, the British police, might hand you over, whether or not these even exist, that's a victory in itself.
Well, I think you're right when you're talking about people out and using these sort of things just to ruin people's quality of life. I mean, it's visible when we look at Navalny, who's been under house arrest, who's been through different trials, who's put on a significant amount of weight since all this started, understandably, not being able to go to a gym, often not being able to leave his home. And you mentioned a very interesting term, which is lawfare, this extent to which the Kremlin and Putin co-ops legal systems and others and use that just to wear people down and to suck up all their time. Is this a new strategy, or is this something Russia has always done?
It's not, the term lawfare is not a term I invented, and it's a term that's been around for 10 or 15 years, and it's often used to describe Israeli policies in the West Bank of sort of harassing activists or sort of Palestinian organizations, and it's been used to describe how Turkey harasses the opposition there, and I simply sort of applied it to Russia. I think it's been used by Putin regularly during the last 10 years. It's just sort of using the law as a weapon and using the law to tangle people up and to, as you said, like destroy their quality of life and also just control their time. So someone like Navalny, it doesn't really matter whether or not he's in prison if you've just bound him hand and foot and he can't control his own agenda. You've created his agenda, which is endlessly coming in out of court cases. And I think it's just a useful term, and I think it explains a lot of how the Kremlin harasses the opposition.
Ben, there were so many attempts actually to understand what's the personality Putin is actually. You've interviewed him personally. How do you think his personality changed since this?
I've never sat down with Putin.
You did not. You did not.
I asked Putin a question at a press conference. I interviewed people around Putin and.
So you were talking. Okay, right. You were talking to the people who were close to him, his allies, people who work closely with him. How do you think his personality changed, or did not change? Maybe you have some other ideas since this conflict unfolded.
What I'm going to tell you about Putin is that I used to work in a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations. It was very well connected, and it knew a lot of people in Moscow. And this think tank supported the EU intellectually, and we did sort of briefings for them. And I was sent to Moscow regularly to go and interview the 30 or 40 people who sort of knew things and who could be your translator to the internal politics of the Kremlin, give you clues, give you indications. And these were sort of politicians, former politicians, advisors, political technologists. And since all these people have either lost their sources, been sacked, or they now issue disinformation. So as a journalist, as an analyst, we don't really have clues into how the Kremlin is, what's really going on in the Kremlin. And as more and more power goes into the hands of the FSB or the hands of the GRU, it becomes more and more of a black box. And I think it's it's a sort of distracting debate to be like, what's Putin's personality and what's Putin going to do? Because the truth is we don't know.
A total mystery, total mystery. Thank you, Ben, so much. We have to finish this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you. Bye. Talk to you next time.
All right, so now we're back in the studio. We had one very interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to another one. Joining us is Sabra Ayers. Am I doing this right?
Correct.
Oh, good. I get worried. You read people's
unusual names, so I'm used to it.
No, it's good, but I read people in print, and reading you for Al Jazeera America, for the LA Times, and the Christian Science Monitor, for all the people you write for. And really we were interested in having you on because you can correct me, but I think you have a wonderful ability to capture some of the smaller things going on and how they fit into a larger picture. You had a piece for Al Jazeera America recently looking at religious intolerance in Donetsk, particularly to everyone who's not Russian Orthodox. And I was fascinated because, you really followed the story of one church. Were they Baptists, or what was the denomination?
They're the Church of Christ, which I think is, he said he wasn't part of the evangelist sort of sect of the Protestant church, but it sounded a little bit more like that. But basically, he described himself as Protestants, and they're Protestants.
Okay. I mean, this story for me was so wild because they had one group of separatists come in and take over their church. Then eventually other people forced them out, and then they had another group move in. And you had pictures of them carrying around live rounds and explosives. I mean, what was that like?
The guy was quite remarkable, the elder of the church that we spoke to. He was really a remarkable guy and very sort of relaxed and at peace with what was Happening.
And he was American, or was he
No,
from?
he's Ukrainian.
He's Ukrainian.
But
Okay.
that
He has a
church
Ukrainian
was,
name, I think. Yes.
Yeah, he was absolutely Ukrainian from Donetsk. He, as I recall, had been born in a village not far from the city of Donetsk. So he was 100%.
And he decided to stay.
He decided to stay. I mean, it was a really interesting story. He was a very compelling character, and I had been sort of hearing these stories about churches being taken by the rebels, and was interested in sort of following it. And when I found someone who would actually speak about it, it was just really great. I mean, really, we kind of lucked on it, and he was very open, and he had sort of this very peaceful way of looking at it, and sort of in that, it was like he was really taking literal that saying from Jesus Christ when he said, if they slap you on one cheek, turn the other and let them slap you on that. I mean, that was the way he was going about this. And he led us to the church. He said, well, let's go try to talk to the rebels, see if they'll let you guys in. And they did, because he had developed a relationship with them despite what they were doing. And they would, when we talked to them in front of him, they would say, look, we can't let this guy open his church again. He's an American spy. This is an American church, and we're trying to build an Orthodox state.
And that's they're equating Protestantism in that case with being an American tool, even though he was Ukrainian.
Yeah, absolutely. And at one point he told me that right after Perestroika, he had actually been baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, but as he described it, said it wasn't his sort of true real path to God, and so he eventually found this church, which was indeed sort of started through some American missionaries.
Well, which is very common in the 90s, that you had a lot of missionaries who moved in, you know, and were working in these rural areas where they saw, you know, their interpretation of the Soviet Union, this, you know, kind of atheist state where it was very hard to get access to Bibles and that education, so a real sense of mission there.
He actually had told me that he had been the head of the atheists in a factory where he had been a director during the Soviet time. So he had been from one scale to another. But you know, once the conversation between him and the rebels was really interesting, and the way they had this sort of peaceful standoff. And,
was it really ideological? Sorry to interrupt. Was it really ideological? Did those guys really believe that he's an American spy, that this kind of church is bringing an American trace into this conflict? Or what was it about? Was it about property, about the place?
I think for what the rebels, what they're saying, it's ideological, and they are trying to say that they are trying to start this Orthodox state. This is what they're fighting for, to create this sort of identity of you know, Ruski Mir, where they are, you know, and defining that partly by people that are traditional Orthodox, and that is the one true religion for them. Whether or not each rebel believes this, I don't know, but that is sort of what they're following. It's what they're grabbing onto, and they do seem to be pushing that.
Well, I mean, what strikes me is this issue of morality is very important to there. I mean, there are elements, you know, almost trying to present it as a crusade, but what I find really fascinating is some of it can be a mixture kind of Soviet morality, you know, all these kind of more socialist things, but then with kind of Russian Empire or post-Soviet orthodoxy and this kind of hodgepodge, basically.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is what it strikes to me is that they are trying to kind of you know, and when you look at what Putin's doing and what the Russian nationalists are doing, it's sort of like pushing this idea of, well, you know, we want to be a great power again, and the great Russian power is formed on this Orthodox belief, and they're trying to create this.
Well, Moscow's the third Rome, and being
exactly. Trying to create
power.
this sort of identity that they can get people behind, and people feel secure in it, and this is you know, part of the reason why Putin becomes so popular.
I was so struck by the Soviet parallels because in the Soviet Union, I mean, not to come back to this too much, but I mean, it was common for these churches when they had their ceremonies, it would be in someone's small apartment, which is something you talk about, and forcing things underground again.
Yeah. And he had said to me, because that church now, you know, they've lost probably half of their congregation, and left because they were simply, it's dangerous to be. He's in an area of Donetsk that's been hit pretty hard. There's a lot of bomb shelters there and that sort of thing, and it's so that a lot of people left because of that, but a lot have, like many people who are still in the rebel-held areas, have nowhere to go. So they do hold meetings now in private apartments, and he sort of
secretly.
He said
almost
it's not
secretly.
so. Yeah, he said he said he's talked to his not constituents, but congregation. Parishioners, and said like keep. You know, before they do have this very, you know, instead of talking about like loving Jesus and spreading the love of God and that sort of stuff, he's told them, tone it down. Don't talk about it when you're in public. Don't talk about people, because you're just at this point, we are out of favor with the current.
What about the Orthodox Church? How do they act there? What do they do? How do they work with people? How active are they right now?
Actually, I don't know. I haven't researched that as deeply, but I do know that they are still active. I mean, people are still going to the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly those that are follow the Moscow Patriarchy. Are, you know, they haven't had any problems at all. Well, you know, beyond the sort of like nature of being in a conflict zone, they haven't had that many. But are they reaching? I asked him, the elder I spoke to, I asked him if he had sought sort of advice or help from the Russian Orthodox Church, and he looked at me and he said, I don't think they're interested in helping us. So I think from talking to him, the sense that I got was he felt that they were perhaps not supportive of other Christians and other alternative Christians.
Well, which is, you know, traditionally considered kind of the missionaries being almost an attack on traditional Orthodox land, and there might be some aspects of that. But I also wanted to ask you had another Really great story. I think so.
Interesting. Several interesting
Complimentary.
pieces.
They are really
yes.
good. I'm not promoting. I get no feedback or kickbacks from any of that. But
No, thank you.
talking about the people from Donetsk who've come to Kiev, and in particular one bar. What's the name of it? Or-
Splietny.
Okay,
Splietny.
that followed its clients from Donetsk to Kiev and keeps many of the same clients. People active from different groups, but also from Izolatsia, from isolation. This arts group.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a really cool place. I haven't been there. I know you've
I've been there. I've been there recently, and apart from people who probably went there, people from Donetsk, but there were lots of foreign journalists in there hanging
Probably
in
following
there.
your story.
Probably one of the most popular places among the foreign journalists right now. But were you tracing those people from Donetsk back here?
No, I wasn't on that. You know what struck me is, I really think there are sort of two stories or two paths that there's coming out of those people who have the million plus people who have left the Donbass area, and there are those which I've written a lot about, which a lot of our colleagues have followed, and I know that you guys at Hromadske have, the refugees and the IDPs who have had a hard time settling in, and they're sort of still trying to find work, still trying to find an apartment. They have faced a lot of discrimination, but as well as a lot of volunteer support. I don't want to, there has been an overwhelming, as we know, but there's this other angle of a lot of these young Donjani who have come to Kyiv and Kharkiv and other cities and have really begun, I think you guys have all seen it in our sort of outside of work spheres, these people who have ingrained themselves in society, and they've become part of it and added to it, and I think that's the other side of the story. And this story came to me because a guy that I work with, a local photographer who's from the East, he said, I went to this bar the other night and I basically saw every single person I knew, and he told me the story, and I thought,
back in Donetsk.
yeah, and I thought that was just a great little success story.
It's a slice of life, and I think what's interesting here is, as opposed to, especially opposed to the U.S., where young people, when they go to university, they leave their hometowns, they go elsewhere. In Ukraine and much of the former Soviet Union, they keep living with their parents. They're more rooted to the place that they're from.
Right.
So it's interesting to watch these people who kind of have people they know from school. Some of you who then start to use Ukrainian because they're in a place where Ukrainians use more and they had it at school.
Yep.
But you have this kind of energy and things being done and a little bit of a new identity, still rooted in Donbass, but with different structure.
And I think it also sort of talks to or speaks to the idea that there's so much of what this conflict that's happening in Ukraine that is in many ways generational. Most of the guys I was writing about were sort of under the age of 35, and most of them younger than that. And for them, as they described it, and as I sort of have watched the situation, for them moving around the way that we're used to as Westerners is they're more comfortable with that. Whereas for their parents' generation, people who are sort of like 40 plus, that's a scary risk for them. It's not what they're used to. They don't really have that skill set, to use a sort of funny term, of how to do that and how to rebuild
the way
themselves.
of life changing out of necessity.
And I think that this younger generation are the ones that are sort of like moving, pushing the
They have to be very adaptable.
To change
Well, we
Ukraine.
look forward to reading what you write about that in the
Thank you.
future, but thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you for having
Some
me.
very interesting pieces.
Thank you so much for joining
Thank
us,
you.
Sabra.
Now we want to turn back a bit more to global news. This past week, as we mentioned, it is the one-year anniversary of Russia annexing Crimea. In our next segment, we want to take a closer look at that. And Angelina, I think, can do the introduction.
Yes, so a year has passed since Russia annexed Crimea. Lots of stories are coming just to analyze what happened with different angles, stories with different angles. But tonight we were having a very interesting guest, Olga Dukhnich, who is a former professor from Torek University in Simferopol, who specializes in psychology and political psychology as well. Olga right now works as a contributor for several media, right? For one. But Olga has lots of columns and very interesting articles, analytical articles on the current state, on some perspectives regarding Crimean question. And there's one we would really like to start with, a very interesting one, where you talk about if it's possible at all to research what is the political mood in Crimea? Whom are Crimeans supporting? Whether it's possible to do any psychological, any social polls, any researches on that?
I think you mean the last polls of GFK,
Right.
which is well known now. I have a well-founded claims to this research because I'm not sure that it's possible now to investigate, and I have no claims to data processing. I mean, in general, I'm not sure that it's impossible now. It's possible now to investigate occupied lands and occupied peninsula like Crimea, and of course not by the telephone survey. And it's
Which was done, right,
yes,
in this survey?
And in this situation, when people under the pressure and all human rights are violated in Crimea, and they're afraid of to be taken to the prison because it's everyday practice in Crimea.
Well, so what was the
and
result
all
of this
them.
survey? Maybe we should mention that before we criticize this.
Do you remember some results of this survey?
Yes,
What was
the
it
most
saying?
conflict question was about the percentage of people who support Russia in Crimea, and in this poll it was nearly 84%.
So quite high. I mean, almost
Yes.
comparable to the percentage of Russians in Crimea, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
No, the percent of Russians in Crimea and 53%.
Yes.
Oh, it's much
Yes,
lower.
yes,
Sorry,
yes,
I'm
yes,
mistaken.
yes,
I
yes.
need
But
to
we
work
don't
on.
know what about the census. The next census, which they had been doing in Crimea during the last several months, and now we have approximate results of this Russian census of Crimea, and they state that it's nearly 70% of Crimean inhabitants are Russians.
I mean,
For us, it's very surprising.
Interesting. I mean, it's possible, unfortunately, that people who feel, who've been oppressed and targeted, especially Ukrainians who kept their citizenship there, Crimean Tatars, some people have left, but not the majority. I mean, my question, because a lot of your research and what you've written about looks at this question of fear and concern, right, in these studies. And that I find very interesting because, for example, I had a colleague who was Russian who went to Crimea, who spoke to people on the street, spoke to people on the street in a Russian area, spoke to people on the street in a Tatar area. In the Russian area, he got, very strong feedback that they were pro-Russian, that they were happy, and in the Tatar area, no one spoke to him. He went up to them and they were concerned to speak to him. And it seems to me something like that can be motivated by fear, that if you know what the government, the kind of result they want, what they want, people are more inclined to answer a certain way, even if it's not necessarily what they believe. Is that true in terms of statistics?
I'm not sure that it's true in terms of statistics, and according to Crimean Tatars and compact place of their living, the last case it's about Ilmur Merov, ex-head of Bakhchisari region. He's a Crimean Tatar, and he sharply wrote on Facebook about Russian occupation in Crimea, and I know that days ago he was invited for interrogation in the Security Council, and he's a very old person and not so healthy person, and I think it's not about him, but it's like a way to frighten the Crimean Tatar inhabitants. That
Yes, we have lots of
every
reports
action will
coming.
have reaction
And we have lots of
Crimean.
reports coming about human rights
Yes.
violations from Crimea. But what I wanted to ask you, this is of course a very important thing you concentrate in your columns, is a notion of occupation. What happens to people under occupation? What do you think has changed since?
A year
I
ago.
think we have really, I'm personally worried about the social transformation of Crimean society, because I know that people, especially if they work in a state institution, they're encouraged to write denunciation for their neighbors, for their colleagues. And
Want to denounce them for what? For
if they say something incorrect about Russia, if they say something incorrect about Crimean government, and it's really the situation of anxiety, and people are very closed, and it's even, I don't know, when people meet each other, they try to guess in which side you are, and only then started to talk.
Something that will happen under occupation
Yes,
in any times,
it's typical
right?
for occupation, yes.
And just one short question from me. What do you think what do you think about Ukraine's strategy on winning back, on getting back Crimea? Is there a real strategy? Do you think it might work? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we still haven't any strategy. We have some strategy about Crimea and return of Crimea, but I think it will be a very long process that we see in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It sometimes takes more than 20 years or so, and I think we should be prepared for a long process and a long game, that is to say, and we should care now about the young people who live in Ukrainian reality, who has experience of Ukrainian reality. I mean, my students and maybe students which just now finished their education. I think we should keep these people in area of Ukraine. And we need a lot of cultural, a lot of educational project for them on the mainland, and try to help them to stay Ukrainians.
All right. Well, thank you for keeping our
Thank you
focus
so
on
much.
that. Now we want to play a brief video just about the challenges that Crimeans are faced with a year later.
Ситуация развернулась таким образом на Украине, что мы вынуждены начать работу по возврату Крыма в состав России. Потому что мы не можем бросить эту территорию и людей, которые там проживают, на произвол судьбы под каток националистов. И поставил определенные задачи, сказал, что и как мы должны делать, но сразу же подчеркнул, что мы будем делать это только в том случае, если будем абсолютно убеждены в том, что этого хотят сами люди, которые проживают в Крыму. Конечная цель была не в захвате Крыма и не в какой-то аннексии. Конечная цель была в том, чтобы дать возможность людям выразить свое мнение по поводу того, как они хотят жить дальше. Говорю вам совершенно откровенно, честно говорю. Я про себя подумал, если люди так захотят, значит, так тому и быть. Значит, они будут там с большей автономией, с какими-то правами, но в составе украинского государства. Пусть так и будет тогда. Но если они захотят по-другому, тогда мы не можем их бросить. Мы референдума знаем, и мы поступили так, как обязаны были поступить.
All right. Now we want to turn our attention to another major event of this week. Now, on March 19th, the Ukrainian Parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, passed a new law that changed the voting rules for all companies where the state holds more than a 50% share. Now, when 51% of shareholders are present, they can vote. Previously, 60% were required. Now, this law focused on one particular company, that is Ukranafta, which is an oil and gas company. After the law was passed, in this company, the Ukrainian state owns 51% of the company, and Dnipropetrovsk governor Ihor Kolomoisky's Privat group owns 43%. Now, under this old system, where it was required to have 60% of the shareholders present for a vote, by withholding their 54%, by not having them show up, they could stop issues from coming to a vote. Under the new law that was passed this week, that's no longer possible. Now, after this law was passed, there was an incident at the office of Ukraine Transnafta, which is a little hard to keep all of these separate. There's Ukranafta and Ukrtransnafta. Transnafta, the trans implies transport, and they're responsible for moving the oil and gas of this other company. The exact financial arrangement is not entirely clear, but they have an arrangement whereby they transport oil and gas.
And it's owned by the state. We should remember that Ukrtransnafta is owned
is 100% owned
by Ukrainian state, right?
Yes, so we have that. And in the wake of this legal change, there were masked men dressed in camouflage who occupied their offices. Shortly thereafter, Ihor Kolomoisky appeared there with his own bodyguards, was inside. It was not entirely clear what had happened. And then after he came out, he was asked a question by a journalist from Radio Free Europe, which was basically what he was doing there, what the reason for that was. And we have a video for you now of what followed.
Скажіть, будь ласка, що робить голова обласної адміністрації вночі?
Ну, с тобой хочет увидеться. Другой возможности нет, как тебя увидеть, твое лицо. Радио Свободы. А что ты не спрашиваешь, как рейдерский захват в Укртранснафте произошел? И русские диверсанты сюда попали, а? Что ты об этом не спрашиваешь? Или тебя Коломойского, блядь, надо увидеть? Мы освобождали здание Укртранснафта от русских диверсантов, которых захватили. А ты со своей свободой сидишь тут, блядь, и караулишь, блядь. Как тёлка, блядь, своего неверного мужа.
Игорь Валерьевич, так что...
Ну что, ты заткнулся уже? Или про паспорта хочешь спросить?
And so, I mean, as you can see watching the video, there are a lot of profanities. It's not a behavior considered for a public official, but one thing we want to look at and is concerning are the broader issues here. It's the role of oligarchs in post-Maidan Ukraine, and in particular, looking at oligarchs who are so-called patriotic oligarchs. Ihor Kolomoisky has played, a large role financing different battalions. Ukraine today as the governor of Dnipropetrovsk region, but there are still questions, even for people and oligarchs with a lot of money who support the state, who are really there. Are there limits on which they should be able to use that influence to profit from it, even if these systems have been in place for a long time? And the question there, on the one hand, is does the Ukrainian state want to limit that? There's all sorts of pressures in terms of finance, on reality, on trying to create a new system and trying to show reforms that are tangible by people. But on the other hand, for oligarchs who have supported the state and have provided functions that the state hasn't been able to, there's a worry that, especially in an area like Dnipropetrovsk, which is close to Donetsk, that any sort of weakness or attempts to reform could, allow separatists to gain more influence, could allow Russia propaganda programs to come farther. And that's a very difficult question to approach at a time when the Ukrainian state finds itself both, in terms of pure guns outgunned, but also financially in finding support for programs, for refugee programs, for volunteer programs, for military programs.
That's a really tricky question, as you say, very tricky question for the president, for the government in the first place, I'd say. And after this incident, of course, Ukraine and probably the whole world was waiting for some official reaction from the president, from the cabinet of ministers, from the government, to see how they react, not only, of course, to this kind of speech, which is obviously unacceptable, but also to this kind of move, yes, to this kind of an operation started in the office. So it took almost half a day till the president reacted with a reprimand, which is also a question whether it's a proper reaction, whether it's a proper reaction to what happened. And now, having all that, having that incident several days ago, even today we have some updates, right? We have some reports coming from the office of Ukernafta this time, which almost half is owned by Privat Group, owned by Igor Kolomoisky, which in this office happened almost the same story with people in camouflage, entering the office and barricading them from the inside. So even after a deal, yes, we had reports that Kolomoisky went to see the president, and he also went to see government officials, and they had a deal saying that four companies will check into the activity of Ukrtransnafta. So the question is, what was the deal about if this kind of thing happens today, right?
And I mean, the issue when we're looking at this, it's not entirely clear what's going on, but there's enough that's unclear to be concerned about. One other video we just want to show, this was outside the office of Ukranafta while there were these people inside and, blocking access to it.
Они там остаются, почему они не выходят? Что они там будут делать? Они будут там ночевать, спать.
Финансовые документы жечь.
Да? Ну а вы?
Вы шутите?
Слушайте, в нормальной стране.
All right, so I mean, that's just giving an indication there's some uncertainty, some questions, and questions about the directions things are going in. As is often the case in Ukraine, there's a lot that's unknown, but we want to keep an eye on it just to be aware of the direction things are moving in.
Yeah, now we'll be moving forward. We are really pleased to have tonight he's right here, our guest, the ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, Mr. Jeffrey Pye. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be with you.
Lots of things to talk to you about, which probably Ayn will
we have some larger questions about the U.S.'s approach to Ukraine, what the solution, what the way forward is, what if Russia's position is changing. But first, to ask another question that we really have to ask. I mean, we've heard that you met with Mr. Kolomoisky. Is there a U.S. position on this? Is this a priority for the U.S. at this point?
Well, Ian, let me put it this way. I'm not going to talk about my private conversations with Governor Kolomoisky, but we have a very strong view on the rule of law in Ukraine. The Maidan Revolution was about building a society which is more just, more democratic, governed by rules. I think there's nobody I know in this country who wants to go back to the days of Yanukovych and the raider attacks, the use of violence to achieve economic objectives, and the idea that there were certain groups or certain individuals who were above the law. So I think the principle that's going to guide the U.S. approach to these issues is, first and foremost, rule of law, transparency, and urging the Ukrainian state to work in a way that's consistent with those objectives.
Why would you meet the governor in the first place? Why would you meet with him?
Again, I'm not going to go into my private conversations with Governor Kolomoisky.
Sure, we're not asking for the content.
He is a governor of a very important oblast at a critical moment in Ukraine's history. The United States is deeply engaged in Dnipropetrovsk. We're working actively in areas like aerospace, work with companies that are down there. So it's quite natural that I would meet with Governor Kolomoisky like I would meet with other major oblast governors.
Have you met with other governors in the past in Ukraine?
Sure. As I travel around, when they come into Kyiv, I've actually give you an example. One I haven't met yet is the new governor of Kharkiv, and we've put the lines out and are hoping very much to see him when he comes through Kyiv when he's got some time. So I mean, very much part of my job or any other diplomat who's here.
I mean, maybe this is too abstract, but it seems like, in diplomacy and countries' relations, we can talk about the investment of one country and another, and interest. Certainly a country like the U.S., which is large, which is active everywhere, at any given time there are countries that are more on the radar and maybe less on the radar. But it seems with, the U.S. giving more money to Ukraine and being more involved in some of the domestic politics, or at least funding some of it, there's a larger investment on the part of the U.S. and Ukraine that we've seen before, maybe a larger interest in some of the policies and the rule of law. Would you agree with that, or how would you evaluate the situation?
I'd put it this way, Ian. We've made a major investment in the success of Ukrainian democracy. We've done so through our diplomacy. We've done so through the financial support that we're giving, 2 loan guarantees now, $1 billion each. And we have worked closely with our European partners to ensure that the voice of the Ukrainian people is heard and that Ukraine is not left alone as it faces this campaign of aggression coming from Russia. But as I've said on many occasions, my view is Ukraine's got 2 wars that it's fighting today. One is the conventional warfare in Donbass, the war of aggression that was started by Russia, and the other one is the war for reform. And I think this whole episode, which was described in your lead-in segment, is a very good example of the issues that have to get worked through if Ukraine is going to be the kind of successful European democracy that the people of Ukraine have clearly signaled they want through both the parliamentary and presidential elections of last year.
Talking about the war, sorry. A year has passed since the annexation of Crimea, and probably, obviously, was the beginning of the war. It started with the annexation. What do you think could be done in this regard how could the world, the United States and the international community deal with the fact of annexation and with Ukraine winning back Crimea?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we are never going to acknowledge the illegal annexation of Crimea. That's just a fact of life. It's clear American policy. It's not going to change under any administration. President Obama has made clear that the sanctions which were imposed against Russia in response to the illegal annexation of Crimea are going to remain in place. So we're going to stand foursquare with Ukraine in that regard. To answer your question, how does Ukraine get Crimea back? I think it comes back to the Second War, to make Ukraine as successful as possible in terms of reform, economic progress, deepening of democracy. And eventually you get to the point where the Crimeans are going to say, well, we want to be back on board with that because that's a positive vision of the future that we want to be part of.
And it seems tricky because I know that's a model. I know you don't like comparisons, so this is always hard, but I'll throw it out anyway. Sure. We'll deal with it. I mean, that's a model that has been thrown out with Georgia a lot, right? Where when they're having their own development and going through a boom period of time, where they would say, the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians, once they see how good things are, they'll want to come back. I know one of the obstacles when I was traveling is unfortunately many of the people didn't have the opportunity to see it directly themselves. We had an episode last week, or a show last week focusing on propaganda, and when we have this pass system coming into effect, limiting people's movements, and when you have, very polarized media, it can be hard to present an image of that progress. I don't know. It seems hard to go back or to sell people on some of the positives of being in a state, especially as there's an interest for people in breakaway areas and certainly for their backers to move them farther apart.
Right, but we don't accept the premise that what happened in Crimea was a genuine reflection of the will of the Crimean people. It was a bogus election held at the point of a gun, clearly inconsistent with all of the polling data, even the polling data that Russian groups themselves have acknowledged. So our view on this would be Ukraine needs to focus on making its own Maidan revolution as successful as possible. Let us and the rest of the international community continue to impose a price on Russia for the outrageous act of aggression that was committed during the invasion last February, and then let time do its magic.
Now, turning to the other front, I mean, what's the status of military aid at this point? Because when I have traveled in the East, one of the first, and people ask me where I'm from, and I say I'm American, and the first thing
where are the
I get, the first thing I get afterwards is like, where are the weapons? Why aren't they coming? Why aren't you supporting us? I don't have any insight into that, but since you're here today, you might have a bit more. I mean, it seems to an extent that this hasn't been something that the Obama administration has wanted. There was an act passed by Congress that enabled them to do this. Obama has said that they're rethinking it, that they're looking at it. Where are we right now with the rethink? Is there, a deadline with that? Are we looking at change? Because it seemed like things slowed down approaching the second Minsk agreement, trying to really go for that peaceful route. Where do we stand?
First and foremost, Ian, we've massively grown our security sector assistance to Ukraine, about $120 million over the past year, up from a program that was less than $10 million when I arrived in this country. Congress has appropriated additional monies in this year's bill. Vice President Biden called President Poroshenko last week about an additional $75 million. So far, non-lethal assistance. You're going to see that rolling out in the next couple of days and weeks. There are going to be some Humvees that are going to be delivered, some armored Humvees that we'll be delivering in the short term. We've also notified publicly to Congress and now here in Ukraine our intent to move ahead with what I think is a very important training program for the National Guard, which will be conducted out at the training range in Yavoriv. In many ways, that's perhaps one of the most important aspects of what we're going to do in the security sector, because it's about building new software, about building new structures, which again meet the aspirations of the Ukrainian people, move Ukraine towards the European standards that the Ukrainian people have said is their choice through these elections, in which President Poroshenko has clearly signaled he wants to achieve. So we're doing a lot. We're trying to do it as much as possible jointly with our NATO and European partners. It's important that the UK, Canada, Poland, and others are also moving ahead on these training programs. We're delighted at that. And again, as regards the lethal assistance, As you noted, the administration, my government, has made clear we haven't taken anything off the table at this point. It's an active topic of consideration. General Breedlove was in Brussels today talking about the pros and the cons. Sitting here in Kyiv, for me, the fundamental consideration is how do we support the diplomacy? How do we support the Minsk peace plan? Because that's going to be the vehicle to normalize the situation and end this terrible violence that Russia has inflicted on the people of eastern Ukraine.
We know we travel a lot through the East. We talk to ordinary people, to civilians, to the military, and the main concern is that no one knows when and how and why the ceasefire regime could be broken. There is no obvious reason why it should be broken. Lots of concerns about the possible spring assault. Everyone talks about it. How do you think, and what are the possible reasons why this ceasefire regime could be broken? I know it's just a speculation, but still, what's your opinion on that?
Well, Angelina, a couple things. First, we all need to do everything we can to see that the Minsk agreement sticks. Russia is not doing that at this point. We continue to see Russian heavy equipment moving across the border, tanks, rockets, other armor. Russian military, Russian officers remain on the ground in Donbass, providing tactical command and control. Russia continues to provide intelligence support, their drone operations over Donbass almost every day. So Russia is not complying with what it promised in the Minsk agreements. So first and foremost, we've got to see that the three initial steps of Minsk are carried forward. The ceasefire, the verified withdrawal of heavy weapons, verified by the OSCE, and OSCE SMM has played a critical role, and the withdrawal of all of these foreign fighters. And that's what's going to set the stage for the larger process. That's what sets the stage for elections. That's what sets the stage for the implementation of the special status that the Rada approved last week, a courageous and important act. But the sine qua non, the single essential requirement, is that Russia stops fueling the fire of conflict in Donbass the way it has done since last summer.
I mean, do you think that the Russians are using this as an opportunity to regroup? Because right after the agreement was concluded, the Ukrainians lost the Baltsova, and there's a lot of reports about equipment still coming through, and this was the experience after the first Minsk agreement. I mean, is that what's happening? Meanwhile, they were also quite critical of this new law giving autonomy to the Ukrainians, to the Donbass.
It's very clear that Russia continues to engage in supply operations. I mentioned the OSCE just a minute ago. It was very interesting. The most recent OSCE SMM report talks about T-72 tanks being sighted in separatist areas. This is a tank that Ukraine doesn't operate in the ATO area, so that only could have come from Russia. The weekly SMM or OSCE report from the border also talks about ambulances being loaded, taking things back into Russia, and it talks about heavily loaded trains moving through the night that nobody can inspect. The border is wide open right now, and Russia is taking advantage of that open border to pour fuel on the fire. That's what has to change.
Now, is there a red line for?
We've already heard from some European politicians and authorities that there's a red line, like starting an offensive against Mariupol, which is a little bit weird. While we had Debaltsevo, so Debaltsevo doesn't count.
Right.
So what do you think? What's the red line?
I agree with you. I think for diplomats, it's very dangerous to get in the business of drawing red lines in one place or another, because then the aggressor is going to just take another chunk of the map. That seems to be happening. Look at what's happened over the past couple of days around Stansia Luhansk and all of that. So we've got to keep an eye on the agreement, which was signed by the Russian government, signed by Zakharchenko and Plotnitsky at Minsk. You asked, what are they going to do? I have no idea. What they keep talking about is they want to acquire at least the entire oblast. That is not consistent with the agreement they signed, and it's certainly something that will entail further costs for Russia to the extent Russia is giving the marching orders at this point.
So what should be done in this case? More sanctions? More?
First principle for the United States is unity with our European partners. It's been critically important over the past year that we have moved forward jointly with the members of the European Union, Canada, Switzerland, and others in the international community. It's had a real impact on Russia and the Russian economy. So we want to maintain that unity. Doesn't mean that we do exactly the same thing at the same time, but it means that we work closely to support each other's diplomacy, to understand each other's analysis, and to advance what is a clear shared objective, reinforcing the principle of territorial integrity, reinforcing the principle that you can't change international borders through force, and reinforcing the principle that it's only the Ukrainian people who get to choose their future. It's not anybody sitting in Moscow or anybody sitting in Washington or Berlin or Brussels. It's people sitting right here in Kyiv and in the rest of Ukraine.
I mean, are you able to say, are there particular partners that President Obama works close with when they're trying to change policy on Ukraine, or there might be a shift? I mean, is it Berlin? Is there clear leaders? Because we had, the Ambassador Simon Smith from the UK on recently, and we're talking a bit how, the UK is never fully marginalized, but we certainly see Germany and France playing a larger role in recent years. I mean, has the US, in terms of Ukraine, worked more closely with those two countries?
I work with every single one of my 28 or 29, counting Ambassador Tombinski, EU counterparts. And I think our policy is most effective when we're working across a broad front. Clearly, Chancellor Merkel has played a critical leadership role. It's one that we strongly support. Speaking personally, I think it's extraordinary that you have a national leader who's been willing to invest as much time as she has in trying to build a diplomatic off-ramp for President Putin to take to begin de-escalating this crisis. And I think we're all grateful for the role that she's played in that regard. I suspect the people of Donbass are particularly grateful because the shelling and the violence that took place around the airport and every place else is no longer taking place at the same level. But what's happening today is unacceptable. It's certainly unacceptable to my government. I suspect it's also unacceptable to most of the governments of the European Union.
So we've heard from the European leaders and from the representatives of European diplomacy that further sanctions is not an option right now with the current state of affairs. But at the same time, I know I'm repeating myself in this case, but at the same time we have these reports. Yes, we have this growing concern that anything may happen. So there is obviously no step that could, let's say, go one step forward before the other side would start an offensive. I mean, prevent it, rather than not stop it when it happens.
Well, let me start, first of all, by saying I think that the decision which came out of last week's European leaders meeting was an important signal of intent. They made very clear there was unity among all 28 that the sanctions will be maintained until the Minsk agreement is fully implemented. One of the critical points of Minsk is restoration of Ukrainian control over the international border, monitored by the OSCE. So that's a big commitment by our European partners. And of course, we're going to stay in close touch as we assess how much progress Russia has made towards that goal. But I can tell you right now, speaking for the US government, based on our own sources of information, as of today, Russia has made zero progress in terms of the upholding of that provision of Minsk. So they've got a lot of work to do.
All right, well, we'll continue to watch that closely and follow your tweets and all of your updates
Good
with
talking
that.
to you, Ian.
Thank
like
you.
the jacket. I wore blue and
It's a little similar. I
Yeah.
appreciate the colors.
I'm out of this company with like dress, sorry. Thank you
we'll
so much for
convert you.
joining us tonight. So this was our weekly Sunday show. Please watch us next Sunday, same time, almost same people, same team. Thank you.